Welcome to today's video. I've got quite an interesting one for you today. Now, Charlie, my other half, on our vlog channel, Charlie and Rob, go check it out. She recently went to Bulgaria and learnt some interesting things. And one is to do with today's video on how Bulgaria, although aligning with the Germans during World War II, did not sacrifice their Jews, and they pretty much all survived the war. Let's find out more about it.
Centropa was created to provide a platform for Holocaust survivors in 15 European countries to tell us about their lives, and mostly through their family pictures. Since these are personal stories, they're not meant to provide our readers with an historical overview. One could say these stories are not about 20th century history per se, they're about what the 20th century did to the people we interviewed. Generally speaking, we know less about the Sephardic Jewish communities of Southeast Europe than we do about Jewish communities of, for instance, Germany and Poland. And during the Second World War, Turkey remained neutral and lies outside the scope of our topic. The Nazis invaded Yugoslavia and Greece in March of 1941, and their Jewish communities were horribly decimated. The story of Bulgaria and the Holocaust is a complex one, and although not well known, remains a point of controversy to this day.
I think being from the UK, we learn a lot about World War I and about World War II, but not down in the southern parts of Europe or Africa. We learn about literally Germany, the way they came over to the UK, or tried coming over to the UK and came west, but we don't know more about this. So this is complete news to me because I wouldn't have had a clue which side Bulgaria were on, to be fair, and a lot of these places in this part of the world. So we're sort of blind to what happened and we weren't taught it. So it'll be interesting.
In the online study guide for our Bulgarian films, you'll find links to various books and essays that espouse one view or the other. Our three personal stories, all of which will take you back into the Sephardic world of the pre-war Balkans, are from Larry and Rosa Ansel, Leontina Arditi, and Matilda Albuhar. Here is what we begin with. When the Second World War started, around 48,000 Jews lived in Bulgaria. When the war ended, nearly all of them were still alive. They had not been deported to the Nazi death camps in Poland. The government had refused to comply. Was this a rescue? Some say yes. Others say emphatically not. As Angel Wagenstein, a Bulgarian Jew, said, "We were raped, not murdered, but you don't thank someone for raping you."
Interesting.
Now here's the background to the story. The Jews of Bulgaria were nearly all Sephardic Jews. Many of them trace their roots back to the Spanish expulsion in 1492, a few even earlier. For nearly 500 years, Bulgaria itself was under Ottoman occupation, and the Ottomans were, compared to the Christian rulers to the north, far more tolerant toward their Jewish subjects. Bulgarian Jews made up only a tiny minority of the country, less than even 1%. There were very few wealthy Jews. Most were as poor as their neighbors in this relatively poor country. As we hear in all three of our stories, these Bulgarian Jews said they felt very little anti-Semitism while growing up in Bulgaria, which also had a large percentage of Muslims, Armenian Christians, Bulgarian Orthodox, Roma, and Tartars.
This part of the world, obviously now going to Tirana in Albania, Sarajevo in Bosnia, obviously Charlie's been to Sofia in Bulgaria. It does seem like there is a real mix of cultures, a real mix of religions. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't believe in any higher power. But actually, from what we've gathered, most of the time, I'm saying most of the time, these religious groups just get on with each other. They, some of them are friends, some of them are not necessarily friends, but they get on with each other and there's no real tension. There are obviously moments where there are tension, like the Bosnian War, for example, but on the whole, it's so multicultural and actually life goes on, mostly anyway, mostly, I'm generalizing.
We also learned that Larry was taken into forced labor during the war, Rosa and her family were deported from Sofia to a small village, and Matilda tells us the remarkable story that she and her father, in March 1943, waited in the town of Burgas to be deported, and for some reason, the deportation order was canceled. Matilda does not provide us with any context for this story, since as an elderly woman recounting her childhood, she would have not really known what was going on. So now, let us unwrap this very complex story. Bulgaria under King Boris III was not a totalitarian state, as was, for example, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Although Boris ruled as a dictator in 1935, historians Esther Benbassa and Aaron Rodriga tell us in their book, The Jews of the Balkans, that parliament continued to function, as did its political parties. Further, Bulgaria was never occupied by the Germans. Bulgaria was an ally, and Germany was Bulgaria's most important trading partner. Germany put pressure on Bulgaria to pass laws against its Jews. In October 1940, the law of the protection of the nation was brought before Parliament. Intellectuals in the Bulgarian Orthodox Church were vigorously against it, as were the Bar Association and the Medical Association. But the law did pass in February 1941. And in January 1942, after the Wannsee Conference in Berlin, the Germans began pressuring the Bulgarians to deport their Jews to the death camps they had set up in Nazi-occupied Poland. June 1942 saw the passing of laws in Bulgaria that forced Jews to wear yellow stars, which Leontina Arditi and Matilda Albuheri tell us about. Economic restrictions against Jews began, and by this time, many Jewish families had become destitute. In the fall of 1942, the Germans exerted yet more pressure for deportation, and in February 1943, Alexander Belev of the Bulgarian Interior Ministry agreed to deport 20,000 Jews.
It must be a really tricky one because during wartime, you almost, the people on the countries on the outside almost have to pick a side quite often, and it's who they think is going to win, isn't it? Let's be honest, because the victors write the history, don't they? And at the end of the day, you don't want to be on the wrong side of history. Yes, there's the whole thing of do what you think is right, but imagine the Bulgarians siding with the Germans, who they know are a stronger power, and they want to side with because they think they're going to win. The pressure on this Bulgarian government to basically do as the Germans asked must have been immense. It must have been immense because if you're getting most of your trading from the Germans, you know, that's where your finances come from. And then imagine if you said no and you'd be cut off. That must be difficult. So it's thinking of the majority, unfortunately, and I get it, it sucks. But if it was less than 1% of the population were Jewish, the majority sometimes rules. Not an easy decision.
He knew what their fate was going to be. As we have seen, 2 years before this, Nazi Germany had invaded Yugoslavia, then Greece. Because Bulgaria had been an ally of Germany, it received Macedonia from Yugoslavia and Thrace from Greece. Around 12,000 Jews lived in these territories occupied by Bulgaria, and they were marked for destruction. The Bulgarian government, through its police, rounded up and deported around 7,300 Jews of Macedonia and deported them to the Nazi death camp of Treblinka in occupied Poland.
So it did some.
Almost none returned. In Larry Ansel's film, he tells us that while he was in forced labor, he watched a train of Greek Jews being taken through Bulgaria by train. Those would have been the ones from Thrace. Around 4,000 Jews were on those transports, which were also headed for Treblinka. Not one person from those transports survived. Belev had now deported 12,000 of his promised 20,000 Jews. He needed another 8,000, and he turned to the Jews of historic Bulgaria. The historian Michael Bar-Zohar tells us that Belev's own secretary was secreting out information to Jewish friends about what was about to happen to them. And we know that a small contingent of Jews from the town of Kyustendil went to visit Dimitar Peshev, a member of parliament. Peshev, according to Benbassa and Rodriga, as well as the historian Tsetan Todorov, worked with 42 other members of parliament who signed a protest against the deportation.
So it's almost like they didn't want to, but they had to sort of agree to some extent. So they agreed less than what they were asked to do, but they did. And obviously then it was almost okay, well, technically the parts of Greece and whatnot, they're not our country, so they can go because we're still sort of protecting our country. We're not necessarily giving our Jews away. Um, it's weird because I sort of feel like, they did sell out. But then I'm thinking, what choice did they have? Mixed feelings with this one.
But the deportations were slated to go ahead on March the 9th anyway. On this day, Jews were indeed gathered up in the town squares in many cities, but in several places there were protests against the deportations. In Plovdiv, for instance, the metropolitan of the Orthodox Church stormed into the square where the Jews had been gathered and demanded from the police that the order be rescinded. In Burgas, Matilda Albuher remembers waiting with all of their goods in the town square, and they were waiting to be taken away, but the mayor himself protested to the government in Sofia. And then by late afternoon, the message came from Sofia. The deportation order had been rescinded. So far, this does sound like a rescue.
It shows that just because the countries seem to be aligning with a certain way doesn't mean all the people think the same. This is the thing. Look at it. I relate to what I know and Brexit, for example, in the UK. Well, yes, as a country, we voted to leave the EU. However, that's not what the country thinks. Do you know what I mean? More of the country actually wouldn't want to leave the EU. And so this situation where, yes, I'm sure there were people that wanted to get rid of the Jews, aligned. However, people power sort of prevailed.
But our story does not end there, as 2 months later, in May 1943, the Bulgarian Interior Ministry, still under pressure from Germany to deport the Jews to the Nazi death camps, presented King Boris with a plan to either deport 20,000 Jews from Sofia out of the country or to the provinces of Bulgaria. Boris signed the second option, and the Jews of Sofia were sent out to the provinces. They lived in small villages in incredibly crowded conditions, and Rosa Anchel tells us about them. During this time, around 7,000 Jewish men were conscripted into forced labor. Some of their Bulgarian overseers acted like beasts, and Leontina Arditi tells us of how her father had been beaten mercilessly. Other overseers had acted more humanely. But this was forced labor, and for the most part, it was brutal, although the Ansels tell us that Larry was allowed to leave his brigade to go and marry Rosa, and Rosa's father received permission from his overseer to attend the same wedding. So the record seems to be somewhat mixed. By September 1944, the Soviet army swept through Romania and liberated Bulgaria. The Bulgarian army changed sides, declared war on Germany, and then fought alongside the Soviet army until the war ended in 1945, in May. Yes, Bulgaria's Jews had survived the war, but the anti-Jewish laws in Bulgaria had ruined them, so much so that nearly half of all the Jews were dependent on soup kitchens just to stay alive. Little wonder, then, that when a new Jewish state was declared in the Middle East, Israel, well more than 90% of Bulgaria's Jews emigrated in search of a better life.
Wow.
That story lies outside the scope of this one. And now let us turn to Dr. Albena Taneva, a Holocaust specialist in Bulgaria today. As we know, the Bulgarian government had no compunction about sending the Jews of Thrace and Macedonia to their deaths, and that same government was willing to deport its own Jewish citizens. Historians continue to discuss just who was responsible for halting the deportations. Most agree it was a combination of decisions that were interlinked with each other. But when Albena Taneva stands in a classroom of young Bulgarians, she presents a different view. It was your grandparents who saved Bulgaria's Jews from deportation, she tells them. Ordinary people had come out onto the street and protested. Ordinary people had said it was wrong. Religious people and communists too. And they all went out on the street to say so. So whether the story of Bulgaria's Jews during the Holocaust was a rescue or not is almost secondary in this case. What is important is the role that civil society played in this multi-ethnic society not very long ago.
Fascinating. Really, really fascinating. So it's a real mix there that it was people power, basically, that saved the Jews because they all got on, they all lived together. I think that shows a real contrast between Nazi Germany, who were voted in, compared to, and they almost should. No, not all of them. I say this, it's not everyone was complicit with what the Nazis did, but they still voted them in. They still had this rhetoric going. Whereas Bulgaria, they obviously already had their government, and it just so happened that they sided with the German Nazis, but the people didn't. So it was people power. It's mixed because I think maybe if the actual Bulgarian government were to do what they were asked, and probably the Jews were going to be sent to the death camps. However, people power ruled the day. And I think that's a massive message, isn't it? That is a huge message that, stand up for what you believe in. And if enough people do, then that can win the day. It makes people think, because if the government has lost control of the people, then they have to rethink. So I think that's really, really an important message. Now, I get it. As a compromise, it ended up being that the Jews were in the work camps. However, they were still alive. So it was that weird compromise that actually they weren't sent to the death camps, but they were sent to the work camps. But they're still alive. They're still able to tell their story. They didn't, yes, life would have been awful. However, it could have been a lot worse. So it's a mix between government and people power that basically saved their lives. It's a real tricky one, an interesting one, because, as I said, I knew nothing about this because we didn't learn about this in school. There's so much to learn that this was just something that wasn't taught. But I think it's these sort of things are so important because it shows that stand up for what you believe in and things can change, things can get better. Really, really interesting. Now, don't forget, the first episode of Charlie's Sofia, Bulgaria vlog is out. She went on her own, and it's a 3-parter. Go to Charlie and Rob on YouTube. Link will be down in the description. Make sure you like and subscribe for this video. And as always, I will catch you next time.